Okay, I'd like to begin the shir today in Masechet Berachot Ali Bala Halacha. I was discussing the different Gemarot that have discussing Kavannah and Tefillah. I'd like to dedicate the shir this morning to Rav HaGaon Adin Even Yisrael Steinzel Zichron Tzadik Livracha. Also for Harav Aaron Volkan Zichron Tzadik Livracha. Also for Avi Mori Va'ater Roshi Tzvi Hirsch Ben Mordechai. Also for Hami Mori Va'ater Roshi Eliezer Ben Yishayahu David. Also for Haim Shmuel Yaakov Ben Aryalev. Also for David Binyamin Ben Moshe Yaakov, and for Shemaya Ben Adina Ruach Adonai Tenechem Began Eden. Also for Hatun Hana Bat Mazar Miriam, Ruth Bat Rachel. Also for Meira Bat Haim, Zina Bat Shura, Hana Rachel Bat Binyamin Yehuda, and Rachel Bat Leah. Ruach Adonai Tenechem Began Eden. Le'adir Ben Ametim LaHaim Rufa Shlema for Sheva Ben Hatun Hana. Also for Reuven Ben Hatun Hana, for Eliyahu Ben Sarah, for Moshe Ben Bevai, for Yoshua Ben Moshe, for Chaim Shnur Zalman Yehuda Ben Hinda Yocheved, and also for Dr. Zev Ben Leah, El Narafan Alehem, El Narafan Alehem, El Narafan Alehem. Also for Marcel Bat Fortuna, for Chava Miriam Bat Bunya Reza, and for Chaya Miriam Bat Esther. El Narafan Alehen, El Narafan Alehen, El Narafan Alehen. And Afar Shema for all the people affected by the coronavirus, may they have, and any cholim, may they have a complete and speedy recovery. B'toch Shah Cholei Yisrael. El Narafan Alehem, El Narafan Alehem, El Narafan Alehem. The zechut of the Torah we're going to learn today. So we discussed last week the Gemara and Masechet Berachot and Daf Hei Amud Bet, which was a chazara for us. We were discussing the concept of Samuch Lemitati, that there were that Tanya Amba Binyamin Omer Al Shnei Dvarim Haiti Mitztaer. There are two things I would be regretting my whole life. Kol Yamai Al Tfilati Shetehed Lifnei Mitati, which means I would be careful that my prayer would always be Lifnei Mitati. Ve'ami Tati Shetehed Netuna Ben Tzafon Ladaram, and that his bed should always be placed from north to south. Now the Gemara asks a question about Tfilati Shet Lifnei Mitati. What does it mean that prayer should be before the bed? What does it mean before the bed? If you want to say it's really before the bed, mamash. Wasn't it said, where do we learn that a person when he's praying should not have anything interposing between himself and the wall? That Chizkiyahu turned himself to the wall and he prayed. So we see from here there can't be anything in between him and the bed. So him and the wall, the bed, how could it be between him and the wall? Anything that's movable is not allowed to be an interposing between the person is praying and the wall. So they don't really mean lifnei mitati, which means before my bed. Elas emas samuch lemitati, meanings what? That close to my bed or next to my bed, meaning what? Next to when I wake up. And if you look at Rashi on the side over here, what is this? Samuch lemitati, kol yamai nizharti, all my days I was careful, shelo la'asot melacha, that I would not involve myself in any melacha. We've already learned this before, that a person is not allowed to engage in melacha before the time. Once the time of prayer comes, he's not allowed to engage in melacha before he prays. The shelo la'asot b'Torah, and also Rashi adds, not allowed to delve into la'asot b'Torah, to involve himself in the Torah. Kishamati mimitati ad she'ekra kriyat shema v'yitpalel, which means this rabbi was careful that he would not be doing any melacha or any esek in the Torah, any significant involvement in the Torah, from the time he wakes up until the time he reads kriyat shema and prays. That's what Rashi said. And Tosafot, of course, brings a question on that. Ela ema samuch lamitati shelo haya oseh melacha ad she'yitpalel, that he wouldn't do any melacha until he prayed. Rashi perash afilu limod. Rashi said even to learn. That Rashi was medayek. What does it mean samuch lemitati? Not just that he doesn't do melacha from the time he wakes up in the morning, but he actually doesn't learn. Shasu limod kodem tefillah. That's what Tosafot is saying. But that was not exactly the girsa of Rashi. Rashi specifically said la'asok b'Torah. The Tosafot, either they had a different girsa or the Rashi, I'm not sure, but the Tosafot is basically saying that Rashi said that a person is not allowed to learn before prayer. V'lo yadati menala. And the Tosafot is asking, I don't know where Rashi got this from. The Lakaman beperek shenin, they bring a proof from the Gemara that we learned in Perek Sheni, in the second Perek of the Gemara Masechet Brachot, which is ahead of where we are now, and Daf Yudal and Amud Bet. Amrena, and it says over there, Derav Makdim Deumashe Yadem Bavrech Matne Pirkei V'Karek Reshma. That Rav, what did we do? When he would wake up, he would wash his hands, he would make a bracha, presumably Birchot Torah and the bracha of the Netilat Yadayim, Birchot Torah, and then he would teach a parak of Mishnah. He would teach a Mishnah. Well, according to Rashi, how does Rashi understand this? How is he teaching a parak of Mishnah? Rashi, according to Tosafot, you said that you can't learn beforehand how would Rav would do this. Ki mataz zman kriyat shema, once the zman of kriyat shema came. So we discussed last week, and the resolution to this we brought from the Zohar. The Zohar discusses the same idea of Chizkiyahu elakir, vayahsev Chizkiyahu elakir, and then the Zohar goes off and says a person should be taking from the Etz HaChaim before he prays. What does this mean? So we have to make a diuk between what type of learning a person is doing. When Rashi is saying a person is not allowed to la'asok b'divrei Torah, which means he's not allowed to be delving into, shall we say, pilpulim, or significant discussions, because then what happens is if he's still in his mind is tarud and all the different opinions, he's not going to be able to have proper Kavannah and Tefillah. But if a person's just learning halacha pesuka, if a person's just learning halacha that's already established, which means he's not delving into the details of the derivations of the halacha, just what is the halacha, or perhaps he's involving himself in the sod, he's involving himself in learning Kabbalah, this would not be a prohibition. This would not be something that would be a problem. This would be okay. In fact, it might even be preferable as we're going to learn as we go on further.
So the question is, I didn't get sorry, I was moving around a little bit. So is it preferred to learn before Tefillah or no? How do we? Because Rashi has had a different opinion, right?
Okay, so the answer, we said it depends on what a person is learning. Okay, if a person, for instance, ideally a person should not be learning Gemara and Poskim before learning. Okay, Daf Yomi is a little different. So it's not that a person can't learn Gemara. Remember the example that the rabbi brought was Rav, who would teach a parak of Mishnah, which means Mishnah is not necessary. Doesn't require a lot of derivations and delving in detail. So that would be allowed. Or a person's doing Daf Yomi, that would be allowed. Why? Because most of the time in Daf Yomi, you don't go into iyun, it's bikiyut. It's just, trying to get through the daf and getting through the topics of the daf. It's not iyun, it's not in detail. A person's not going to be tarud. But a person doing what we're doing now, which is really Gemara and Poskim, let's say we're going to bring the Ran, we're going to bring the Rosh, we're going to bring the Rambam, we're going to bring Shulchan Aruch. This might not be allowed, because then you have all these opinions floating in your head. You're trying to figure out what the right thing to do, what the right thing is, and in that situation, God forbid, a person is going to be matrid in his tefillah, and he's not going to be able to focus. So that's one. Halacha pesuka would be allowed. So a person can pick up about David Yosef's book and read the top part, which being halacha, or if a person is Ashkenazi, can read Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. This would be allowed because this is halacha pesuka. This is halacha that is established. There's no requirement of derivations and details on that. And the other thing I added, of course, a person can learn Chumash. A person can read Pesukim. A person can even perhaps learn Chumash with Rashi, because that's not. But a person might not be able to have Chumash with Rashi and Orach Chaim and Ramban and Ibn Ezra. That might not, because then a person might be tarud in all the different opinions and not be able to focus properly in the prayer. With the Sod, this is unique, because in the Sod there is no machloket. If there's machloket, it's because a person doesn't really understand what he's reading. So in that situation, the Sod, that's why the Zohar quoted the Etz Chaim. Etz Chaim is specifically, according to the Kabbalah, referring to the Sod. The Etz Hadat Tov Hara, that would be the Torah Shebe'al Peh and the Torah, the regular Torah. But the Etz Chaim is specifically referring to the Sod. So that a person is allowed to learn before the Tefillah, because in that situation he's properly mechaven his lev. And that's why if you look at most Sephardic Sidurim, there's a specific area from the Tikkunim that a person should be learning. Patach Eliyahu Navi Zachul Tov. This is an ideal thing for a person to do right before every tefillah. So we see, and that's sodot, that's all sod. Why? Because there's no machloket there. There's no different opinions. Of course, a person has to understand. It requires a person to understand the depths. But that understanding gets you to know Hashem, and through getting to know Hashem, that's how a person can have true kavanah and tefillah. Because the greater a person understands the greatness of Hashem and the smallness of man, that's how a person can approach ani. That's how a person can approach and get close. So therefore, the sod is certainly permitted to learn, and we see in the sidurim that we have Pitichat Eliyahu. That is what a person learns before prayer, and ideally a person should learn that before every one of the prayers.
Yes, so what about timing? Up until what time are you allowed to learn if you didn't pray yet?
Okay, so that's going to depend. How tarud is the person? So in the shiur I gave earlier today, which I'll be posting Be'ezrat Hashem by the end of today, I was discussing that there's a din in the Shulchan Aruch that a person has to prepare before the beginning of the prayer, not by the beginning of the Amidah, before the seder of the tefillah completely. There's a concept that a person, when they come in, they should have 5 minutes or 10 minutes, everybody according to their level. The Hasidim Rishonim used to spend an hour before, an hour during, an hour afterwards, yes? But this is for the Hasidim. This is not, I'm not talking Hasidim, Bekesher, and Strimal. These are people who live their lives like that. But the Aruch HaShulchan even brings in that situation that a person has to have some preparatory time before prayer, before the beginning of the prayer, to pray. And there's an opinion that that should be done sitting rather than standing. The Sfaradim, it's very, very easy, because before Minha we have Korbanot. Shacharit, a person comes in, you have Korbanot also. So you have the Korbanot, that's a preparatory situation. With Minha, we have Korbanot and we have Ashrei. So usually you sit down and then you stand up for the Tefillah. Amongst the Ashkenazim Achenu, they just have Ashrei. They don't say the Korbanot. So it's mistama that might not be sufficient, because the Seder of the Tefillah begins with the Ashrei. But clearly there's an idea that a person should not just come to the prayer. A person should spend about 3 minutes, 5 minutes, or some amount of time before the prayer. Now, if a person was involved in learning beforehand, and he was involving in Shas and Poskim, he has to clear his mind so that he can focus on the prayer. Now, some people have the ability to clear their mind without just hitbodedut, but by internal reflection and meditation. But in that situation, some people can't do that. So what a person would have to do is put the Gemara and Poskim down, and then pick up Halacha Pesuka, or pick up a couple of Pesukim, or maybe read the what we talked about, Patach Rabbi Eliyahu and Abi Zachul Tov. Reading that, now the person is going to get into proper framework for the prayer. And that was the Gemara we discussed last time. It's a brief Chazara where we did. So now, let's go on to the next Gemara. This is the Gemara in Masechet Brachot on Daf Kaftet Amud Bet. This Gemara we did not yet do, but it's totally germane to the topic we're discussing about Kavannah and Tefillah. So it says over here on Kaftet Amud Bet, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ha'oset Tfilato Keva. So the Gemara is bringing the Mishnah that we discussed earlier, that Rabbi Eliezer said that a person who does his Tfilah Keva, this is not a good thing, but Tfilah should be Tachanunim. So let's see the Gemara, how it learns out this Mishnah in understanding what is Keva and what is Tachanunim. So the Gemara asks, My Keva, what does this mean, Keva? What does this mean that a person cannot make his prayer Keva? Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, Amar Rabbi Oshaya. Rabbi Yaakov, the son of Idi, said in the name of Rabbi Oshaya, and this is, if you look at the little gimel there, this is quoted in the Gemara by the Rambam and others, and we'll learn this a little bit later on, Be'ezrat Hashem. Kol shetfilato dome alav kemasui, which means, what does this mean, Keva? Keva means that his prayer to him is like a burden. And when he's performing the mitzvah, his goal is to relieve himself of that burden. That would be, according to this rabbi, the definition of keva, and this is not the way to pray. And according to some opinions, the person is not yotzeh b'di avad in tefillah if this was his attitude vis-a-vis prayer, because it has to be tacharanim, and this makes it keva, and this is not appropriate. That's the first opinion the Gemara brings. The Rabbanan Amre, and the rabbis say, Kol mi she'eno omra bilshon tacharanim. Whoever does not say the prayers in the language of Tachanim, in the language of supplication, the translation. And if you notice, this is also quoted as a Daled, so we understand from here that there's not a machloket between these two opinions. They're both correct, which means both of these are qualifications for something that is keva vis-a-vis something that is tachanunim. Continuing on, Rabbah and Rav Yosef Damar Tavahu. Rabbah and Rav Yosef both said together, they give another opinion, Kol she'eno yachol lahadesh bo davar, ba davar. Whoever cannot renew something, which means we have the formula of the prayer that we have, which is the 18 brachot, now 19 brachot that were formulated by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the 18 and the 19th brachot in the Bet Din of Rabban Gamliel. And that's the formula, yes, but a person has to, according to this opinion, add something. He has to add something. That's why we have the concept, especially in Shema Kolenu. A person has the ability to add things in Shema Kolenu, but not just there. A person has to add to the tefillah something according to this opinion. Otherwise, the tefillah is keva, it's not tachunim, which means a person has to personalize the prayer, as opposed to the format of the prayer which was established by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. A person has to personalize the prayer in a way specifically towards his desires or his needs or things that are involved in his life at that particular time. That's the third opinion that's brought here. And if a person doesn't do that, then it's considered to be keva. Continuing on, Amar Bizera Ana Yachelna Lehadushe Be'ominta. I could introduce a novel element in every prayer, but I'm afraid that perhaps I'll be confused. So the rabbi here at Rabbi Zera is saying what? That I have the ability. There's a lot of things going on in my life. I can bring up these things in my prayer. But what's the problem? If I go off the reservation a little bit, I'm afraid I'm going to get confused and lose my track of where I am. So we understand already, this is talking about here Rabbi Zera, which is it's basically saying his Kavannah might be interrupted by being mehadesh. He has the ability to be mehadesh, but he's afraid that if he does chidushim in the prayer and he adds his own things in there, that he's going to lose track of his place. Of course, we have to remember this is a time before there was sidurim, before there were actual books. People did this all from memory, so it's very easy to understand if a person doesn't have good focus and they go off on something of their own, that they may lose track of where they are. Abaye bar Avin Rabbi Hanina bar Avin de Amre Tavayu, and Abaye, the son of Avin, and also Rabbi Hanina, the son of Avin, both of these are two brothers. They both said, Kol she'en mitpalel im dimdume hama. Whoever doesn't pray with the orange of the sun. Well, we'll see what this means shortly. Amar Rav Chia bar Abba bar Yochanan, Rabbi Chia, the son of Abba, said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, mitzvah lihitpalel im dimdume hama. So we see there's a concept of praying at the transition between night and day and night. A person has a mitzvah, it's a proper thing to do, to pray with the dimdume chama. Now, that it says over here, Amar Rav Zera, Ma'ikra, what pasuk do we learn? Where do we learn this from? That a person should be basically praying with the dimdume of the chama. Yira'ucha im shamesh v'lifnei arech dor dorim. A person should be seen with the shemesh, so when the shemesh is coming out, this is the ideal time for the prayer of shacharit. And then the end of the pasuk is telling you the ideal time for the prayer of minha. V'lifnei arech dor dorim. That a person should pray minha when? Before the moon, which basically means before the sunset. So we understand that the ideal time for shacharit is at sunset. The ideal time for minha is before the sunset. Now, of course, we'll learn later on in Masechet Brachot that a person has the ability to pray minha from minha gidolah, from the hour of 12:30 is sha'ot zmaniot in the day. But clearly that's not the ideal. A person ideally should be praying minha more towards the later on in the day, closer to the sunset. This is what the rabbi is saying here, and this actually is quoted as the halakha. You'll see the Haywul, which we'll see shortly. Maybe not today, but another day. And then continuing on, light ala de ma'arava amai de masle im demechama. And then it says over here in the Ma'arav, which means basically in Israel, they would basically curse or they would disparage a person who prayed with the dimdume chama, specifically for minha. What's the risk? That if a person waits until close to sunset, there's a fear that maybe he won't pray on time and he'll pray after the sunset. We know for minha prayer, we have the ability from halacha to pray minha prayer up until 13 and a half minutes after the sunset in sha'ot zmaniot. But beyond that, a person should not be praying minha it's too late. Avar zmano batel korbano. So if a person pushes it, there's a possibility that if he pushes it, therefore he may forget or he may actually pray too late. So this is a difference of opinion here. My tama, what's the reason? Dilma mitrafa le shata. Because what might happen? He might get lost in the time. He thinks he has more time, and then he starts to pray, and it's already after sunset. This is the sugya of the Gemara we just discussed over here, which there's all the different opinions, the difference, what is keva and what is considered to be tachanunim. So look at the Rashi, where I have circled kimasui. What is kimasui? The hainu lashon keva, which means this is what it means lashon keva, which means a masui, like a burden. Chok kavua hu alai lehitpalel. That I have this rule that I have to pray. It's an established rule that I have to pray. V'tzarich ani latzet yedei chovati, which means the person, what does it mean, keva? That according to Rashi, what does this mean? The person's entire thought is, how do I fulfill my obligation? Not because he wants to fulfill the obligation according to all the opinions, but more, how do I fulfill the obligation so I can be done with it and be done and remove this burden from me? This is Rashi is saying over here what it means kimasui, like a burden. Continuing on, Misha eno yachol lechaven libo lishol tzrachav, which means what? What if a person can't to have kavanah to ask for his needs? This is basically the whole purpose of tefillah is to have kavanah, and this is why the rabbi brought the concept over here that a person should bring mehadesh davar, should bring something new. If a person is truly involved in the prayer, that means there should be something personal in his life that he needs, or maybe somebody else needs that he knows about. So this should be able to be mehadesh davar, to have kavanah, proper kavanah, to ask for his needs. Lehadesh badavar kebebakashato, which means we're not allowed to make any additions in the first 3 brachot of the Shemona Esrei and the last 3 brachot. The first 3 brachot there are no additions there, and the last 3 brachot there are no additions there. The only place a person is allowed to make additions is in the bakashot, which are the 12 or now 13 brachot that are in between, from Atah Chonen all the way until Shema Kolenu. Though that is the area, those are called the bakashot, the requests, and in those areas a person has flexibility depending on the topic of the bracha to ask specifically for needs that they may have or needs that they know others that have. So this is what Rashi is saying over here, but lechadesh in the bakashot, specifically in the requests. The hainu lashon keva kayom ken etmol, ken machar. What is Rashi saying? The second opinion is that every day his prayer is exactly the same. The prayer yesterday, the prayer today, the prayer tomorrow, it's all the same. Why? Because he's just following the formula. He's following the formula and not adding anything inside. One could also understand that perhaps maybe to look a little deeper in the Rashi, what he's saying is that the emotion, a person should not just be reading the words. And if you look at the Yerushalmi, which we're probably not going to have time to go through the whole Yerushalmi, basically the Yerushalmi understands this igeret, that the person's like reading a letter, which means no emotion. When a person's reading a letter, there's no emotion, or he's reading a novel. Yes, we have the Tefillah. It's reading it as if it's just an igeret. It's a letter to be read. This is not the way to read it. It has to be read with emotion. So a person, maybe he's not able to be mehadesh davar because maybe he doesn't have the ability. In the words that he's using, there should be differences between day to day of his emotional investment in the different areas of the prayer. If he's not doing that, then it's not tachanunim, then that's called keva, according to what Rashi just explained. Continuing on, Dilma mitrinda, which means a person's going to be matri, a person's going to have tirda. Shema et velo eda lahazol makom shifsakti, which means if a person is in the middle of one of the brachot of the bakashot, and then he goes on to his personal bakashot that are related to the bracha, there's a fear that the rabbi had that he's not going to remember where he left off. He's not going to remember where in the tefillah to resume back to the formula that is necessary that the Anshe Knesset Agdola established. She'eno mitpalel im dumdimei chama. Rashi is now going to comment on this. The hainu lashon keva, which means this is lashon keva. Tfilato alav chok kavua latzet yidei chova ve'eno makpid lahazer acha shah mitzvah ve'et ratzon, which means the person has a flexibility for the time, shall we say. Shacharit, a person has from sunrise up until the end of the 4th hour. For minha, a person has from 12:30, from 12 and a half hours into the, 6.5 hours into the day, half an hour after Chatzot, and shouts Maniot all the way until sunset. So a person prays whenever he can, which means he doesn't look for the best time to pray. He doesn't look for what we call the Et Ratzon, the best time to pray. And clearly the Gemara brought two Pesukim, one pasuk for Shacharit, talking about one pasuk for Mincha, talking about the ideal time for prayer. So if a person is focused on getting it over with, therefore he'll pray whenever he can rather than waiting for the Et Ratzon. And this is interesting because there's a concept of Zrizim Makdimin Lemitzvot. So now for Shacharit that works very, very nicely, because Shacharit, the Zrizim would pray at sunrise. Yes, there is an ability to pray before sunrise, but that's in most situations, that's only when a person has pressing need. So there's no concept of Zrizim before sunrise. The concept is sunrise is the ideal time. L'chatchila, a person is yotzeh at sunrise. B'diavad, if a person has to pray earlier because he has to go out, he can pray earlier, and b'diavad he can pray later. But l'chatchila should pray at sunrise. So the Zrizim is only within the context of the allowed time. But earlier, it's not Zrizim if a person prays before Alot HaShachar because he wants to get it over with. That would be considered to be Keva. And the same thing for Mincha we see. So even though a half an hour after Chatzot, a person is able to pray Mincha, a person ideally should not pray Mincha at that time. Because if he always prays Mincha at that time, it appears it's a burden that he wants to relieve himself of, rather than waiting for the ideal time, which may not be ideal for his schedule, but is ideal for the prayer Et Ratzon, which is before sunset. It means a person, if he's truly looking for the prayer to be the best, he should find the best time to pray. As we learned last week or 2 weeks ago, Ba'et Hanan el Hashem Ba'et Hahi Lemor. Moshe Rabbeinu, when it talks about his prayer, it specifically says Ba'et Hahi, at that particular time, which means Moshe Rabbeinu would pray specifically at the best time, what we call the Et Ratzon, the ideal time for prayer. And that's when a person should be focusing on the prayer, because that's when it's more likely to be accepted. Whereas if a person is just looking to fulfill his obligation and he's able to fulfill his obligation earlier, it's not Et Ratzon, but it's earlier he's going to fulfill his obligation. And this is what Rashi is saying, this concept of Dimdumei Chama, is that he's trying to pray whenever he can early so he can get it over with. This is called Keva, and this would not be ideal. Okay, let's continue on to the Rashi. So it says over here, Dimdumei Chama, Tfilat Yotzer im Hanetzach Hama. That Tfilat Yotzer here is referring to obviously Shachrit, Yotzer or Vorech Choshech. This should be with Netzach Hama. This should be with the sunrise. Obviously, a person has to start the Baruch Hu a little bit before the sunrise, so that you can get to Yiraucha im Shamash, so you can get to the Shmona Esrei Amonai Sfatai Tiftach Ufi Agit Tilatecha at the sunrise. Utfilat Mincha im Shkiat Hama. And Tfilat Mincha obviously has to be before Shkiat HaChama, but with the Shkiat HaChama, which means a person should be getting praying Mincha before Shkiat HaChama, maybe 15 or 20 minutes before Shkiat HaChama, and this way he finishes the Tfilah of Mincha at Shkiat HaChama. That is called the Et Ratzon. That is the ideal time. This is what it means, Dimdumei Chama. And according to this opinion in the Gemara, we'll see this is not the halacha. The halacha is the first two we discussed, that this would be considered to be keva. If a person is specifically going to only pray when it's convenient for them and not at the Et Ratzon, according to the two opinions in the Gemara, that would be considered to be keva, and a person be not be yotzeh. That doesn't mean a person is not yotzeh if he prays at Chatzot, a little bit after Chatzot. Why is he doing that? If he's going to pray at, say, 12:30, Chatzot, half an hour after Chatzot and Shatz Maniot, because he knows that later on he will not have the opportunity to pray because he's traveling or because his mind is going to be so involved that he's not going to be able to focus, then that's different. Then his goal is to try to pray in a way that he can be maximizing his Kavannah. That would not be considered to be Keva. He's trying to fulfill the mitzvah in the best way. Whereas if he's just trying to fulfill the mitzvah in the easiest way, the most convenient way, that would be Tfilat Keva. Okay, continuing on. V'lifnei areach zo mincha. So the beginning part, Yiraucha im Shamash, I'm sorry, I skipped a little bit. Yiraucha im Shamash, zo tfilat yotzer. This is tfilat Shacharit. Lifnei areach, this is zo mincha. So we understand that this pasuk is telling you the ideal time to pray Shacharit, which is Netzach Hama, and the ideal time to pray Mincha, which is right before Shkiat HaChama, right before the areach. continuing on, Laiti b'ma'arava, that there was a curse put on people in the Ma'arava, which means in the land of Israel. Al mi shemashet tfilat haminha ad dimdume hama, which means they would, in the Ma'arav, they would curse someone who waits for his prayer for the dimdume hama, which he delays praying minha till the very end of the day. Shema metaref lo asha yedeh ones ve'avar azman, because there's a risk. So we see there was a difference between Bavel and between Yerushalmi, and therefore that's why this is not the halacha per se, that this is not considered to be keva dimdume hama, but we still have this pasuk. So we have to try to understand, how do we fulfill this pasuk? So clearly, it depends on the person's attitude. What's the person's attitude? If he's praying at 12:30, half an hour after chatzot because it's convenient, then that might be an issue. But if he's praying at 12:30 chatzot because it's going to interfere with Kavannah to wait later on, or he's afraid he's going to forget the prayer because he's getting involved in something he's getting involved in, then that would not be an issue. And the same thing here. If a person waits till that time, but he's sure, for instance, when a person knows he sets his alarm, or he knows he has a time for minha that's kavua, he always goes to pray in a certain place, so he knows he's, like, for instance, person's at work and there's 10 men that get together every single day to pray minha, he's not going to forget because he's going to remember it that way. Then it's not a problem and it's not subject to the curse that was from Eretz Yisrael. Okay, I just want to bring a little bit from the Yerushalmi. Rabbi Eliezer Omer ha'oseh tfilato keva, right? Chova kivua, which means a fixed requirement. Kemi sherovetz alav ol, like a person who's is weighed down with a burden. Ve'oseh ota mitzvat anashim milumada. This is the pasuk, by the way, that a person has to be very, very careful not to do mitzvot like anashim milumada, which basically means like a parrot, okay? And this is not just for tefillah, by the way. This extends to all the other mitzvot. The person has to recognize, and the greatest risk of this concept of mitzvat anashim milumada, which is one of the problems that I think it was Yeshaya, if I'm not mistaken. As it says in Yeshaya chapter 29, verses 13 and 14, Vayomer Adonai Ya'an ki nigash ha'am hazeh befiv u'bisvatav kibbeduni v'libo rihak mimeni v'tihi yiratam oti mitzvat anashim milumada. My Lord said, because that people has approached me with its mouth and honored me with its lips, but has kept its heart from me, and its worship of me has been a commandment of men learned by rote. Lachen hineni yosif להפליא את העם הזה הפלא ופלא, ואבדה חוכמת חכמיו ובינת נבוניו תסתתר. Truly I shall further baffle that people with bafflement upon bafflement, and the wisdom of its wise shall fail, and the prudence of its prudence shall vanish. Was saying to the people, and this is the reason why the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, because they did the actions with their hands, but the lev, the heart, was nowhere to be there. This is the concept of mitzvot tzrichot kavanah, that a person has to be mechaven his lev for all mitzvot. Tefillah has a unique aspect that we're discussing in this shiur, but all the mitzvot have a level of kavanat halev, and the problem is the mitzvot that a person is most likely to have this concept of anashim milumada are the regular mitzvot. I remember a number of years ago we had something called Birkat HaChama, which happens once in 28 years, when the sun and the moon and all the planets and the earth are basically exactly as they were during the creation of the world, in the exact position, the stellar position in creation of the world. Just like we have Birkat HaLevana, we have Birkat HaChama, but that's once in 28 years. Unlike Birkat HaLevana, which is once every 30 days, once every month, this is once every 28 years, and people got up early, they prayed Vatikin, they went out, they excited. Once in 28 years, there are books that a person has of halakha that people study, because once in 28 years, then you miss it now, you're not going to have it for another 28 years. But that's a mitzvah that comes once every 28 years. What about mitzvot that we have every single day, like putting on tefillin, like talet? These things are huge. These are big mitzvot. In fact, tadir ve'sheno, tadir kodem. Mitzvot that are tedirot, that are tedirim, that happen all the time, have a higher level of chashivut sometimes than mitzvot that are hat pa'ami. If you think about it, Be'ezrat Hashem, in another couple of weeks, we're going to hear the voice of the shofar. We hear it once a year. This year is only going to be once, not twice, because Shabbat, the first day of Rosh Hashanah Shabbat. How much excitement we have. We hear the shofar, we fulfill the mitzvah, we say that we hear the bracha, we answer amen. Yes, but that's a once in a year year mitzvah. We have all this excitement. But how much excitement we have to have when a person puts on the tefillin every single day. This is the concept of anashim ilumadah. This is a great risk for the mitzvot that are tedirot, that are happening all the time, and a person has to be careful. And perhaps this is also part of the preparation for the tefillah, since tefillah is a mitzvah that happens 3 times a day, every day, unlike tefillin, which is once a day. The tefillah is 3 times a day. There's a much greater risk with tefillah that a person is just going to just do it by rote and routine. And that's what this is talking about here. This is the concept of keva, which basically means rote and routine. It's like a rule. Just like he wakes up, he has breakfast, or he has a cup of coffee. No different. He doesn't have any feeling, or a person when he's driving to work. You remember the first time when you learned how to drive, it was so exciting to get behind the wheel of the car when you were in driver's ed. And then after you got your license, you were able to go in the car. You didn't have somebody there. You were all excited about driving. Now a person gets in the car, he drives, he gets to where he's going. He doesn't realize the entire way it was all autopilot. Yes? But that's okay for driving. Autopilot is fine when a person is driving, or if a person's a surgeon. Sometimes to be on autopilot is good because there's a certain routine that a person has is very, very important in their performance of very, very important details. But mitzvot, the person should never be on autopilot. That's the concept of keva. This is what the Yedid Nefesh is bringing up here. The en lo ta'anug ba'avodat Hashem yitbarach. Wow. Which means he's doing the mitzvah, it's on autopilot. There's no excitement, there's no pleasure. This is the purpose, again, the goal, lehit'aneg al Hashem. The goal of the mitzvot is lehit'aneg al Hashem, to have pleasure, and of course, nachat ruach liyotzreinu, a person should have pleasure doing the mitzvah, and then Hashem has pleasure the fact that you're doing the mitzvah kav yachol. This is the concept of re'utah deliba, which is the highest level of mitzvah. We know there are 5 levels for every mitzvah, corresponding to the 5 levels of the neshama. I'm not going to go into detail about that now. We talk about that on the Monday night class. The 5 level mitzvah, the lowest level of the mitzvah is the ma'aseh, actually doing the mitzvah. Then the next level of the mitzvah is the dibur. The dibur is what separates man from animals. Animals also have ma'aseh. A lion eats and he kills and he eats. That's his ma'aseh. He does exactly what he's commanded to do. So a human being has a higher level, it's dibur, and that's part of the reason why the rabbis added brachot before mitzvot, to involve the dibur, to make it human, not just action. And then the next level above that is the Kavannah. The Kavannah a person has, which means mechaven libo, he's focusing his heart on what he's doing, that he's not distracted with other things, he's performing the mitzvah without distraction. This is what we're talking about here. The next level above that is the mahshava, that a person understands, well, especially a man has to understand, where's mitzvah written in the Torah, what are the different opinions, how do we learn this out, is tefillin 1 mitzvah, tefillin 2 mitzvah, why do we have 1 bracha, why do we have 2 brachot, Ashkenazim, blah, blah, blah. This is a person, the chokhmah that a person has of the Torah, is that level that gives that level to the mitzvah. And the highest level is what we call re'utah deliba, which means the will, that a person has to want to do the mitzvah. A person might have all the other 4 levels. He's got great maaseh, does it perfectly. He says the bracha 100% good, no problem. He has proper kavanah, which means he's focused on what he's doing, and he also understands all the details of, he knows the halachot, and he knows where it's learned from and all that kind of stuff. But he doesn't really want to do it. He would be better off doing other things. He doesn't want to do it. This is what the rabbi has to have ta'anug, pleasure in the mitzvah. He has to enjoy the performance of the mitzvah. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim. That's why the Gemara Masechet Brachot said this is the bracha. When it said over there was a discussion, we learned this a number of months ago, where it says al ozvam et torati. When the prophet was chastising the Jewish people that the temple was going to be destroyed, al ozvam et torati. Why was the land destroyed? Because they left the Torah. And the Gemara frets the kasha. What do you mean they left the Torah? Of course they didn't leave the Torah. They were studying the Torah. What are you trying to say? No, they weren't making the bracha. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim. What do you mean? You mean they would study Torah, which is very, very difficult to do, but to make the bracha before studying the Torah, they weren't? No, they were making the bracha, but they weren't understanding and thinking about what does it mean. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et torato. Do we realize what a special level we have, a special relationship with Hashem? Every mitzvah a Jew does, Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim. Every Jew, Asher kiddishana b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. Us, not the goyim. This is the level a person has to have, especially during the month of Elul. Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to have all kinds of slichot and tachanunim and tefillot and all kinds of mitzvot a person's going to do. And certainly, a person should do this with excitement and love and will. He wants to do it, excited by it. This is what the rabbi is talking about here. Keva is not that. That is not keva. Keva is when a person does it because I did it yesterday, I'm doing it today, I'm going to do it tomorrow, like he has his lunch every single day. En tfilato tahanunim. So when a person has a concept of keva as tfilah, then it's not tahanunim. En tfilah zo re'uya. This is not a worthy tefillah. Because why? It's not tachanunim. In order for tefillah to be worthy, it has to be tachanunim. As we learned, tefillah le'ani ki ya'atov. The concept of tefillah has to be a person ani. And what do we have special about ani? He has kavanah, because if he doesn't, he's going to starve to death. Whereas when the risk here is rum levavo v'shachachta et Hashem Elokecha, which we read in last week's parasha, and we read in this week's parasha we just did now with the king, that he has to have his own sefer Torah, levilti rum levavo, that he should always v'kara he has to have it with him all the time. The king has to have two sefer. Every Jew has to have one sefer. The king has to have two, one that he carries with him all the time. He has to karabo kol yemei chayav leviti rum levavo, because of his kavod he's going to forget. But even for everybody else, a person has to remember asher b'charbana mikol ha'amim, and that's why that bracha is called bracha ma'aliyah, a very high level bracha. Halavai, we should have that in mind every time we do a mitzvah. Asher b'charbana mikol ha'amim. Continuing on, ki ikara tefillah bakashat rachamim, because the essential part of tefillah is bakashat rachamim. A person is requesting mercy. Well, if a person is just doing it by rote, he's not requesting mercy. The words are coming out of his mouth, but there's no emotion. Requesting mercy is an emotional response, and that's why tefillah is not as much intellectual as it is emotional. And that's why there are some that explain that when Rabbi Eliezer says and tefillah that his tefillah should not be keva, he's disagreeing with the rabbis that we learned about before that have zman of tefillah. This whole concept that we have, Rabbi Yudah, we discussed, the zman Kriyat Shema is clear, but zman of tefillah, what do we understand from this? The Torah says, "Oldo b'chol levavchem." It doesn't say time. As far as the Torah is concerned, there's no zman of the tefillah. The rabbis instituted zman of tefillah, shachrit minhan arbit. But Rabbi Eliezer, there are some that say he disagreed with that. He said, no, there's no zman of tefillah. The Gemara is going to learn out in another place, which Bezat Hashem will get to. Halavai, a person should pray all day long. Avani tefillah, David HaMelech says. A person should be in prayer all day. What does this mean? There's times for prayer. This is what creates the risk. Now, Sheikh Knesset HaGedolah did this because they wanted to make sure there was structure. After the destruction of Bet HaMikdash, there was no more korbanot. There's reasons for that. But a person has to be sensitive to the fact that, yes, we have specific times for prayer, but within those times, the person still has to find the excitement in the mitzvah in order for it not to be a type of keva. Continuing on in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yoshua said, "Hamelech b'mkom sakana mitpalel tefillah kasara me'en yudchet." A person who goes in a place of danger should pray a shorter tefillah, what's called me'en yudchet. Omer Hoshia Hashem et amecha et Yisrael b'chol parashat ha'ibur yu tzorchem lefanecha, which means this is the prayer. Anyway, let's not go into this detail. Baruch atah Hashem shomer tefillah v'tahanunim. Notice we add tahanunim. That's the whole purpose of the tefillah. So that's the Mishnah, and this is the explaining of Riyadid Nefesh. Now let's look how the Gemara, the Yerushalmi, deals with this Mishnah. Rav Avhu Amar. What does Rav Avhu say? B'shem Rabbi Eliezer, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, U'bivad shelo yiheh kekore be'igeret klomar, which means it shouldn't be that the person is doing the tefillah and he's reading a letter. He's reading a letter, which means there's no emotion. That he should not read the tefillah like an igeret. We have another mitzvah, by the way, that we do read like an igeret. Anybody remember what mitzvah that is? Chazak. Very good. That's the reason why we unroll the entire Megillah, because it's supposed to be read like an igeret. It's supposed to be read like a letter from beginning to end. Unlike a Sefer Torah, is not like read like an igeret. You have one section at a time, and then you roll it. You have the next section, then you roll it. You have the next section, right? This is the Sefer Torah, but Megillah is igeret. That's why the person who's reading the Megillah for the Kehillah unravels the entire Megillah like a long letter. Okay, and the Megillah, it calls ha'igeret hazeh. So we see there's a concept of igeret. The word igeret is used in the Megillah to refer to the Megillah. So therefore, that's an igeret. Now that doesn't mean a person shouldn't be reading the Megillah with emotion, but the goal is to read the Megillah from beginning to end with no interruption. This is not tefillah. Tefillah should not be igeret. I have the Sidur in front of me. Let me next page. No, that is not Tefillah. There's an emotional contribution that's required. If a person's not doing that, that's considered to be keva. That's not tachanunim. And according to some opinions, the person is not yotzei in the Tefillah. Let's continue on a little bit more in Yerushalmi. Rabbi Acha Amar. Rabbi Acha said, B'Shem Rabbi Yosef, in the name of Rabbi Yosef, here's an etzah, here's an advice that a person's tefillah should not be considered to be keva. Tzarich lehadesh ba. Why does a person have to have a chidush? So this tefillah should not be keva. We just said that the purpose, so it should not be anashim ilumadat, should not be like rote and routine, like an igeret. Well, in igeret, there's no chidushim in an igeret. You read the letter and you're done. So therefore, when a person mehadesh davar, he's showing that he's not reading it like it's an igeret, like it's a letter. That a person should add things that are needed either by himself or his family or his community or the Klal Yisrael, should add things specifically to make the prayer personal in the 12 brachot of the bakashot. Nowadays it's 13, but in the 12 brachot of the bakashot. Continuing on, Achitofel hayam itpalel shalosh tefilot hadashot b'chol yom. Achitofel, now remember, this is before the Anshe Knesset Agdola. Achitofel is a contemporary of David HaMelech. This is before the concept of where the Anshe Knesset Agdola established the three prayers. So it says over here, Achitofel would be mitpalel 3 tefillot, new tefillot every single day. Amar Rabbi Zeira. Rabbi Zeira said, Kol zman dehaina dehavena aved ken havena ta'eh. So this is to do with Rabbi Zera said. This is the same. Our Gemara brought this rabbi as well. And what did he say? Anytime I would renew something in the tefillah, I would make a mistake, which means I wouldn't know where I left off, which means when I would try to be mehadesh dvarim, it would cause me to forget where I was. If you want that your tefillah should not be keva, there has to be another etzah here. Mehadesh devarim is only if a person's tefillah is going to not lose its kavanah, but if a person loses his place, it's a problem. Kayed demar. En lecha la'asot ela kamo she'amar. A person should not do except like it says Rabbi Avahu, what Rav Avu said, b'shem Rabbi Eliezer, which means a person doesn't have to be mehadesh davar. Ideally, a person should be mehadesh davar, but if he's afraid that it might happen, that if he's mehadesh something, he's going to lose his place, no. But he should not read it with igeret. Basically what? There should be an emotional, even if there's no chidush of words in the tefillah, the emotional investment should be there. So if a person needs refuah, and he's afraid if he's adding something to tefillah and rifa'enu, he's going to lose track, there should be emotion. He should spend more time with the words. He should think about it a little bit more. He should reflect. This is making it personal, even though he's saying the words exactly like it's written in the Sidur or Anshe Knesset Gdolah. But the bottom line is there's the emotional investment, and that can change from day to day. So that's what we see. This means not reading like an igeret. Rabbi Eliezer hayam itpalel tefillah hadasha b'chol yom. It says Rabbi Eliezer would pray one tefillah, a new tefillah every single day. That doesn't mean they weren't praying the rest of the day, because they presumably might have been praying most of the day. Anytime a person's thinking about, as he's working, please Hashem give me some assistance, that's a type of tefillah as well. Tefillah is really a connection with Hashem. A person should be connected with Hashem all day, every day. That's the ideal situation. That's very difficult to do. But he would make a new tefillah every single day. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, why the Anshe Knesset Agdolah established the prayers the way they did. Because what happened when the Jews went to Bavel for 70 years, their language already became mixed up, which means their ability to formulate new prayer in Hebrew was already compromised, because the next generation grew up with the language of Aramaic, and that became the language of the people. And prayer is not just for the Sigulei, the Gidolei Ador, prayer is for everybody. So the Anshe Knesset Agdolah realized that they have to make a formula for the prayer that's in Hebrew, because the best language for prayer is in Hebrew, not in any other language, even in Aramaic. Hebrew is the best language, so they made it so that there would be a formula so everybody can pray, even their language may not be so good. The ability to mehadesh dvarim in Hebrew was challenging when their Hebrew became much weaker after Bavel. Rabbi Avu hayam mevarech bracha hadasha b'chol yom. He would make a new bracha every single day. Obviously, we don't make new brachot. This is a whole other issue. Rabbi Yosef Tzaydena Amar b'shem Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yosef Tzayidinah b'shem Rabbi Yochanan said, Lifnei tefilatohu omer, Amonai sfatai tiftach ufi agi tilatecha. So we see before the prayer, now the Yerushalmi is bringing this concept. Our Gemara, Masechet Brachot, already discussed this, and this is what we've been discussing in Sha'arei Orah for the past 4 or 5 months. But bottom line is this concept of Amonai sfatai tiftach ufi agi tilatecha, the Yerushalmi brings, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, before the prayer, before any prayer, a person should say, Amonai sfatai tiftach ufi agi tilatecha. Ulachar tefilatohu omer, and at the end of the tefillah, what should he say? Yiratzon me'pi ve'agon lefanecha, libi lefanecha, Adonai tzuri v'wali. This is the pasuk we say at the end of the prayer, which means at the beginning we have Amonai sfatai tiftach ufi agi tilatecha, and at the end of the prayer we have Yiratzon. The prayer that we're doing should be the Ratzon of Hashem. This is what we're saying at the end. Rabbi Yudan Amar Tarvayu Kumitzluta. No, Rabbi Yudan would say no. Both of these pisukim, Amonai Sfatai Tiftach and Hirason, should be said in the beginning of the prayer, not at the end of the prayer. Amar Shnei Pisukim Lifnei Tefillah. We know the halacha is not like this, Rabbi. The halacha is that we say Amonai Sfatai Tiftach in the beginning, and we say Hirason at the end. This is how the Yerushalmi deals with the Gemara that we just discussed. I have it on my screen here. We'll begin this Gemara. I just want to begin it because it's so beautiful in the beginning. It's hard to leave it till next week, and we'll do this in more detail next week. It says over here, this is on Gemara, Masechet Brachot once again, and Daf Lamed Bet Amud Bet. And once again, this sugya in the Gemara is going to focus on an aspect of Kavannah and Tefillah. We'll put all of these together when we do the Shulchan Aruch on all of these halachot that are being brought here now. But for now, let's just go through the sources in the Talmud. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar said, Gedolat Tefillah yoter mi ma'asim tovim. Tefillah is greater than Ma'asim Tovim. Now, Mistama, that should be difficult to understand because Ma'aseh, Dibur, is not considered to be a Ma'aseh. And we said the world was created, Asher bara Elohim la'asot. The world was created for doing. So since Dibur is not doing, then how is a person doing? How is it? One would think Tefillah should be less than Ma'asim Tovim, but that's not what the Gemara is going to say. She'en lecha gadol b'Ma'asim Tovim yoter mi Moshe Rabbeinu, because the Gemara is going to say there was no one greater in history, in anyone in the world than Moshe Rabbeinu with Ma'asim Tovim. Af al pichen lo na'ana ela b'tfilah. But despite the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu had Ma'asim Tovim, his answer only came through the Tefillah. Shene'emar al tosef daber elai, which means God answered him, even though this wasn't the answer he was looking for. The answer he received was when he prayed. Continuing on, usmichle ale rosh hapiska, come up to the piska. So even though in one hand it was an answer no, but this is how we're going to do it. Because Moshe Rabbeinu said, berana, let me see the land. So God said, berana, no, you're not going to cross the Jordan River, but I'll let you see the land. Ale rosh hapiska. Well, see, despite the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu had tremendous Ma'asim Tovim, and this is at the end of his life, this is in the last month before he died, this is at the end of his life, all these Ma'asim Tovim he had was not enough, except when he prayed, when Vayet Hanan, when he prayed Ba'et Hahi, this is when Hashem listened to his gave him or answered him specifically, not based on his Ma'asim Tovim, but on the Tefillah. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Gedolah Ta'anit yoter min tzedakah. It says here, greater is Ta'anit more than the tzedakah. My ta'ama, what's the reason? Ze begufo v'ze b'mamuno. Now, why should it be that, again, tzedakah is big. Utzedakah tasim mimavet. Tzedakah can save a person from death in some ways. We have to understand that much deeper what that means. But why should it be that a person, ta'anit, is greater than tzedakah?
Much easier to give tzedakah than to actually fast. And when you're fasting, it's as if you are bringing korban.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. How do we understand the first pasuk of Kriyat Shema? ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך וכל נפשך וכל מאודיך. What do we learn from that pasuk?
You have to love the God with your possessions.
That's last. Why is it last?
Was this the easiest?
No. Pumpa kert. It's the hardest. You know? A person, you think about it, a guy comes over to a person and says, your money or your life, yes? If a person follows the Torah, what do?
Give the money.
You give the money. Of course. Person doesn't follow the Torah, he risks his life to save his money. That's completely illogical, right? If a person, b'chol levavecha, which means a person shall love Hashem b'chol nafshecha, with all of his soul, comes before me'odecha. And if you look at the second part of the Kriyat Shema, what do we see? It says ve'asafta deganecha, right? And we think that's a bracha. No, it's not really a bracha. It's a little bit of a klala. Why? Ve'asafta deganecha, you will gather your grain. That's not bracha. Bracha is other people will gather your grain. Well, why in the second paragraph of the Kriyat Shema does it say ve'asafta deganecha? Why doesn't it say that other people will massif the grain for you? Because u'ovdo b'chol levavchem b'chol nafshechem, it leaves out b'chol me'odechem. Okay? Which means that's the more challenging with the money. Because money is called damim. Money is blood. The Torah refers to blood. Money as damim. Right? It's the dam of a person. So on the one hand, your diuk is good, but the problem is it's dam. So whether you're sacrificing your dam as money or you're sacrificing your dam, what's the chiluk? Look at Eov.
What's your answer?
Look at Eov.
Yeah.
Eov. Right? The beginning of Eov, it says, God says, look at this tzaddik Eov, the best man, he's a perfect man. And the Satan says, yes, because you've never tested him. If you tested him, maybe he won't so perfect. So God says, okay, go test him, but don't touch his body. So what does the Satan do? Goes and Eov loses all of his money. Eov loses all of his children. And then, what does he say? Hashem natan, Hashem lakach. Yes, what we say in a funeral, lo aleinu lo alechem, right? And now Hashem goes into Shamayim and says, look at my Eov, the great tzaddik. He's so perfect, yes? And the Satan says, yeah, he's so perfect because you didn't let me test him in his body. You prevented me from touching his body. If I touch his body, now that's different. So Hashem says, okay, you can touch his body, but don't take his life. Don't kill him. And what happens? Then he gets nigufim. He gets all kinds of suffering, physical suffering. And then we have 40 chapters of Eov discussing his conflict and spirituality because of physical body. So there's a big difference between a person giving their life, which is quick and done, right, versus suffering. Okay? Prolonged suffering, one can understand. So therefore, what the Gemara is talking about is a ta'anit. A ta'anit is a suffering. It's a physical suffering. Okay? In that situation, mammon is, if a person, let's say, let me ask a question. It's very simple. Let's say the Torah said, if you give $1,000, you don't have to fast on Yom Kippur. I think some people, there'll be a lot of $1,000, right? Okay, people would do what they can, you know. If we could not fast by giving money, we do it. Okay, so we see that while fasting, that while giving money is difficult, fasting is worse, is harder, and that's why the Gemara is saying Gedolah Tanit Yoter Min Tzedakah. It's going to bring a proof from a different place, but I think the proof from Eov works very, very nicely. You accept it?
Yeah, but if you do both at the same time.
Oh, chazak, which we have utshuva, utfila, utzdaka, ma'avinet roa gzera. That's why part of Elul is the teshuvah, right? What is the teshuvah? That's the tzom, tefillah, prayer, utzdaka, ma'avinet roa gzera, the trifecta. So each one independently has a level of chashiv. Look at the Gemara. First it started off in saying Tefillah is greater than Ma'asim Tovim. And that's why we can sit for 25 hours on Yom Kippur and not do Ma'asim Tovim. What are we doing all day? We're praying. But that is greater than Ma'asim Tovim. And now the Gemara is saying Tzedakah is good, but Ta'anit is better. So now what do we do on Kippur? We do all three. Okay, continuing on. My ta'ama, what's the reason? Zeh begufo, zeh b'mamono. This with his body and this with his money. So the Gemara clearly says that the goof, now it's one thing for a person to die, that's different. That's quick and done. Okay? Lo aleinu lo alechem, we should never be tested like this. But if a person knows he's going to have yisurim, suffering, lo hem v'lo yisurim. If you look at Masechet Sanhedrin, in the whole discussion of the Chevle Mashiach and the rabbis, there were rabbis would say, you know what? I'll come back by Tchiat HaMetim. I don't want to live in the time of the Mashiach. I don't want to see the Mashiach because I don't want to have the Chavelim beforehand. So we understand that people are not willing to submit themselves to all kinds of physical suffering, and that's what the Ta'anit does. But Baruch Hashem, we do on all three of them. Let's just finish up here. The Amar Rabbi Elazar said, Gedolah Tefillah Yoter Mina Korbanot. Wow. we missed the korbanot, we want the Bet Hamikdash, we have to recognize Tefillah, the Gemara says, is greater than the korbanot. Shnei Emar, Lama li rov zivhechem. This is what Yeshaya said in Hazon. Why do I need all of your sacrifices? Uchtiv ufarischem kapechem. But when you spread your hands, this is what the whole purpose of the korban was, to make the lev of the Jew better so he can get close to Hashem and pray. Korban is a means to getting better tefillah. Unfortunately, we don't have the zuchut to have that nowadays. We don't have korbanot. But we still have the tefillah. We have to recognize that tefillah is hazak me'od. And that's what's discussed over here. Okay, Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll stop here. Anybody else have any questions?
No, thank you.
Very good. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.